Christians who keep the Sabbath face a lot of objections from those who believe that the Sabbath no longer applies to Christians. I want to address one of those objections today. If you're interested in what the Bible says about the Sabbath and how it is relevant to Christians, consider checking out my book, Remember the Sabbath. Some have argued that Christians who believe in keeping the fourth commandment, the Sabbath, are not actually keeping it. Why? Because breaking the Sabbath is among a select number of sins that warrants the death penalty according to the Torah, and since no Christian today believes we should kill people for breaking the Sabbath, no Christian actually observes the Sabbath the way the Bible says to do it. Here's one person on TikTok making this argument.
Why is it that nobody who claims to keep the Torah or the law or the Sabbath actually do what the Bible says you have to do? Everyone who defiles it must surely be put to death. This is a command. Everyone must surely be put to death if they defile the Sabbath. So that means it's actually up to you to mutually reinforce this law on others. So why are you not doing that? Why are you pretending to keep the Sabbath? But this is actually what it means to keep the Sabbath. You're lying when you say that you keep the law, and you keep these commandments, and you keep the Sabbath.
So, are Christians who keep the Sabbath being inconsistent by not enforcing capital punishment for those who break the Sabbath? We keep other laws regarding the Sabbath, such as resting, not working, having a holy convocation, and so forth. Why don't we keep the laws that say that those who violate the Sabbath must be put to death? This objection to the Sabbath is not very popular, and for good reason. As you'll see in a moment, it completely backfires on the person making the objection, and I think most Christians are able to recognize that. However, this objection does come up often enough that it deserves a proper response. The first thing to recognize is that the Sabbath is not the only commandment that warrants the death penalty for breaking it. The death penalty is also given as a punishment for things like sorcery, blasphemy, adultery, and murder. The fact that we do not enforce the death penalty for something like adultery today does not invalidate the commandment. Think about it. No Christian would say that you don't actually believe in keeping the seventh commandment if you aren't killing adulterers. How many adulterers have you killed? None, you say? Well, you must not actually be against adultery then. That would be silly, right? So why would we use that logic against the fourth commandment? The fact that we don't enforce the death penalty certainly does not invalidate the commandment. If the Torah's death penalty can teach us anything today, it is that God takes the Sabbath seriously. Breaking this commandment, like breaking other commandments, is still a sin, as New Testament scholar Craig Keener writes. Keeping the Sabbath was a serious matter. The law mandated a death penalty for violating it. Although most of us would not endorse execution for all other capital offenses in Moses' law today, normally we at least view them as sins, offenses such as murder, sorcery, blasphemy, and sexual relations outside of marriage. But this does raise a question. Why don't we enforce the death penalty for these violations of God's commandments? It's clearly instituted in the scriptures, so why don't we do it? Now, this is an interesting question, because critics of the Bible often complain that God is immoral for instituting the death penalty. Most Christians wouldn't go that far. In fact, during our debate, my friend R.L. Solberg admitted that he does agree with the death penalty in principle, but that it had to be applied appropriately. I agree. The only appropriate context for administering the Torah's death penalties is Theocratic Israel based on the Torah. That is, capital punishment can apply only in a theocratic nation in the land of Israel that is governed by elders, judges, and Levitical priests who adjudicate such cases in accordance with God's law. That doesn't exist. So even if we wanted to enforce the death penalty for such sins, we couldn't do it in accordance with God's law. In fact, we would be going against God's law if we did try to enforce those penalties. But once again, the fact that these punishments cannot be enforced does not invalidate the commandments themselves. When Israel was in exile in Babylon, they could not enforce the Torah's penalties for breaking certain commandments, but they still were expected to keep the laws they could keep. keep. Also, in the New Testament, capital punishment could not be enforced either, so such punishments took the form of excommunication. But again, the commandment itself obviously still applied. Before we move on, I want to take this opportunity to address the concerns of critics when it comes to the Torah's death penalties in general. It's important to recognize that the death penalty did not have to be enforced. It did happen, as we will see in a moment, but according to some ancient sources, the death penalty was rarely enforced in theocratic Israel. This was not because people weren't committing capital sins, but because the judges in ancient Israel often chose lesser sentences, which was allowed according to the Torah, as Dr. Paul Copen explains. There were some 16 crimes that called for the death penalty in the Old Testament. Only in the case of premeditated murder did the text say that the officials in Israel were forbidden to take a ransom or a substitute. This has widely been interpreted to imply that in all the other 15 cases, the judges could commute the crimes deserving of capital punishment by designating a ransom or substitute. In that case, the death penalty served to mark the seriousness of the crime. We see a specific example of this in Exodus 21:29-30. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. Here we see that if an ox kills someone, the law states that the owner of the ox shall be put to death. However, it goes on to say that a lesser penalty may be imposed upon him instead. That is, he could be required to pay a redemption price for his life. So even though the crime warranted death, it did not need to be enforced. Check out the teaching I did for 119 Ministries, The Case of the Slandered Bride, for more on this topic. In that teaching, I show how capital punishment did not need to be enforced in the case of adultery either. Getting back to the Sabbath specifically, someone might object to the explanation I've provided in this video on the basis of Numbers 15:32-36. There, a Sabbath breaker is sentenced to death by stoning. For a really great scholarly paper on this passage that addresses the concerns of critics from all angles, I highly recommend this one from Dr. Jonathan Burnside. But in any case, this passage is said to present a problem to my view because it doesn't appear that this case went through the normal judicial protocol. However, this case is an exception that actually proves the rule. This incident happened when Israel was in the wilderness before they entered the land and established their theocratic government. So this was an exceptional case. The text says that they kept the offender in custody, quote, because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. Thus, in verse 35, God himself gave the divine verdict that he be put to death outside the camp. Again, this was an exceptional case and does not inform how we ought to handle such situations in regular life. Again, for more information on this passage regarding what the violation actually was and whether the punishment was unreasonably harsh, check out Dr. Burnside's paper. He does a great job of breaking everything down and answering objections from critics of the Bible. In conclusion, this objection to the validity of the Sabbath backfires when you apply the same logic to other commandments that all Christians believe we should keep. The Torah's death penalties for certain commandment violations do not apply outside of their intended context of a theocratic nation in Israel, but this fact does not invalidate the commandments themselves. Even in theocratic Israel, capital punishment did not need to be enforced for most sins for which it is warranted. Nevertheless, the fact that breaking the Sabbath warrants the death penalty shows the seriousness of the sin. The case of the Sabbath breaker in Numbers 15 was an exceptional case and does not inform how we ought to handle such situations in regular life. Christians who keep the Sabbath are not being inconsistent when it comes to the death penalty. We are taking the Bible seriously and taking it in context. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you did like it, consider giving it a thumbs up and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you want to see more content like this, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. You can also hit that little bell so that you'll be notified when new videos like this are released. I'll see you next time. Blessings and shalom.